My son texted me, "We'll come after dinner." I cleared the plates the next morning. I remember reading the message more than once, not because it was confusing, but because I wanted to hear his voice inside the words, some hint of hesitation or warmth that might explain the silence that followed. I replied simply, told him to drive safely, told him there was no rush, and then I placed the phone face down on the table as if that would keep it from disappointing me. The day moved slowly, the way it does when you are careful not to rush hope. I peeled potatoes and let them sit in cold water, lined up the serving spoons, folded the napkins the way my own mother had taught me, with the crease just right so they would stand without falling. Outside, the sky stayed low and gray, and every passing car made my shoulders lift before settling back down. I did not sit. Sitting felt too close to waiting. I stayed busy, wiping already clean surfaces, adjusting decorations that did not need adjusting, opening the oven just to feel the heat and reassure myself it was still working. At some point, I realized I was listening for a sound I had not heard in years, my son's old knock, 3 quick taps, and then one softer one, like he was asking permission even when he knew he had it. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second announcing itself without shame, and I wondered when clocks had become so bold. Evening came without ceremony. The food was ready long before anyone arrived, and I turned the heat down low, telling myself they might be late, traffic always unpredictable around the holidays. I thought of my daughter-in-law, of how she preferred everything fresh, and I worried briefly about the vegetables losing their color, then dismissed the thought as unkind. When darkness pressed against the windows, I turned on the porch light. That felt like an invitation, something visible, something clear. I stood by the window longer than I meant to, my reflection floating over the glass, older than I expected, smaller somehow. I tried not to imagine them laughing somewhere else, coats tossed over chairs that were not mine, plates passed from hand to hand without a second thought. Instead, I focused on the house, on how steady it felt, how it had held me through years of noise and mess, and now held me through this quiet. At 8, I checked my phone. No new messages. At 9, I poured myself a small glass of water and drank it slowly, as if hydration were an act of discipline. I told myself not to assume. Assumptions are a kind of accusation, and I did not want to accuse my own child of anything yet. At 10, the food had cooled beyond saving. I turned off the oven and sat for the first time all day, my hands folded in my lap, my body stiff, as if sitting were an admission. The house made its usual sounds, pipes ticking, wood settling, the refrigerator humming with gentle insistence. I realized then that I was listening not for footsteps, but for an apology, something that would arrive already shaped, ready to explain everything away. Midnight passed without announcement. There is no bell for that moment, no gentle nudge to tell you that a day has ended badly. I went to bed without changing the sheets, without brushing my hair, leaving the porch light on because turning it off felt too final. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was shallow and filled with ordinary dreams that felt strangely cruel in their normalcy. Morning light woke me. For a brief second, the kind that arrives before memory, I thought they might still be coming, that perhaps there had been a mistake, that phones die and plans shift, and love remains intact underneath it all. Then I saw the untouched table and remembered. Clearing the plates felt less dramatic than I expected. There was no trembling in my hands, no sudden rush of tears. I scraped food into the bin and rinsed the dishes, stacking them carefully, as if care itself might still matter. I noticed how heavy the good plates were, how my wrists ached slightly as I lifted them, a reminder that time had been working quietly while I wasn't looking. I wrapped leftovers I would not eat and placed them in the refrigerator, knowing they would likely go bad, but unable to throw them away just yet. The tree stood in the corner, lights still glowing softly, ornaments reflecting a version of the room that looked warmer than it felt. I sat again, finally, and allowed myself to think not about Christmas, but about patterns, about how often promises arrived already tired, how conversations ended just before anything important was said. I wondered when I had become someone whose presence could be postponed without consequence. That thought stayed with me longer than the disappointment itself. It settled in my chest, not sharp, just firm, like something that would not move no matter how I shifted. I did not call. I did not send another message. I told myself I was giving them space, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped reaching first. The porch light burned all day. By evening, it flickered once, then steadied. I watched it from my chair, feeling a quiet question form inside me, one I was not ready to answer yet, but certain I would have to soon. The porch light stayed on longer than it needed to, long enough for me to forget why it was on in the first place. When I finally switched it off, the click sounded louder than it should have, as if the house itself had noticed the change. The days after Christmas moved with an uncomfortable politeness, each one arriving on time, each one leaving without comment. I woke early out of habit, not necessity. There was nowhere to be, no one waiting for an update, yet my body still followed rules it had learned decades ago. I made tea and drank it standing by the sink, watching steam rise and disappear, thinking how strange it was that something so visible could vanish so completely. I checked my phone once in the morning and once in the evening, telling myself that was restraint. No message came. I did not tell anyone what had happened, not because there was no one to tell, but because saying it out loud would require choosing words, and words can make things real in a way silence does not. Instead, I listened. To the radio host laughing too loudly at his own jokes, to the neighbor's dog barking at nothing in particular, to the creak of the floorboard near the hallway that had always given itself away at night. These sounds filled the space where conversation might have been. I went through the house and noticed things I had been too busy to notice before. A small crack near the window frame, a stain on the carpet shaped vaguely like a leaf, the way the hallway mirror tilted slightly to the left, reflecting a version of me that looked perpetually unsure. I cleaned because it gave my hands something to do, because order can feel like progress even when it leads nowhere. On the third day, I opened the freezer and saw the turkey still there. I closed the drawer gently, as if it were sleeping. I told myself I would cook it later, perhaps for neighbors, perhaps for myself spread over many meals. I did not commit to a plan. Commitment felt dangerous. I found an old sweater in the back of the closet, one my son used to wear when he was home from college, the sleeves stretched at the cuffs. I held it for a moment, then folded it and placed it back where it had been, careful not to disturb the stack. I did not want nostalgia to spill everywhere. On the fourth day, I received a message. My heart reacted before my mind did, a small, sharp lift that surprised me with its strength. It was from my son. He wrote that things had been hectic, that they had meant to call, that the holidays had gotten away from them. There was a smiley face at the end, one of those simple yellow ones that suggest cheer without committing to sincerity. I read the message twice, then a third time, noticing what it did not say. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the empty chairs or the cold food, just movement forward, as if the absence itself were something best stepped over. I typed a response and erased it. I typed another and erased that too. Eventually, I sent a short reply, telling him I hoped they were well. I did not mention Christmas. I did not mention the text that had promised dinner. My restraint felt like maturity at first, then like something closer to fear. I waited to see if he would ask a question, if he would notice the gap. He did not. The conversation ended there, a closed door disguised as politeness. After that, the quiet changed texture. It was no longer empty, it was expectant. I found myself replaying small moments from the past, not the dramatic ones, but the ordinary slights I had brushed aside at the time. A birthday card that arrived late, a visit shortened without explanation, a phone call answered on speaker while other voices filled the room. I wondered how many times I had accepted less because I did not want to seem demanding. The thought did not accuse anyone outright. It simply sat there like a fact waiting to be used. One afternoon, I walked to the mailbox and found it empty except for a grocery flyer. I stood there longer than necessary, holding the metal door open as if something might still arrive if I gave it time. When I closed it, the sound echoed down the street. A neighbor waved from across the way, asked how my holiday had been. I smiled and said it was quiet. The word tasted neutral, almost pleasant. That night, I cooked the turkey. I seasoned it carefully the way I always had and placed it in the oven with a sense of obligation rather than appetite. As it roasted, the smell filled the house, warm and familiar, and for a moment I felt foolish for thinking absence could overpower something so tangible. I ate one small plate and wrapped the rest. The leftovers lined the fridge shelves like evidence. I slept better that night, not because I felt resolved, but because exhaustion had finally made its claim. In the days that followed, I noticed a subtle shift in myself. I no longer jumped at every notification sound. I let calls go to voicemail without guilt. I began to read again in the evenings, long stretches without interruption, letting stories belong to other people for a while. Still, beneath that calm, something unsettled remained, a sense that I was being slowly edited out of a narrative I had once anchored. I did not know yet what that meant or what it would require of me. I only knew that waiting had begun to feel like participation in my own disappearance, and that realization lingered with me, unresolved, like a sentence left unfinished at the end of a page. The invitation arrived in early spring, tucked between a bank statement and a catalog I did not remember requesting. The envelope was thick, heavier than necessary, with my son's handwriting on the front, careful and rounded in a way he used only for formal things. I stood by the door and held it longer than I should have, feeling the weight of it, as if paper alone could carry intention. I did not open it right away. I made tea first, let it steep too long, watched the color deepen past what I preferred. When I finally tore the edge, the sound felt abrupt in the quiet kitchen. It was an invitation to a family celebration, a wedding anniversary dinner they were hosting at a restaurant downtown. A milestone, the card said. There was a date, a time, and a note at the bottom written in my son's hand telling me they hoped I could come. The words were polite, almost careful, and that care unsettled me more than enthusiasm would have. Still, something inside me softened. I told myself this was an olive branch, that perhaps Christmas had been an oversight that embarrassed them as much as it had hurt me. I placed the card on the table, where I would see it often, and tried not to build too much meaning around it. That restraint lasted until the next morning, when I found myself thinking about what to wear. The restaurant was one I recognized, a place I had passed many times but never entered, its windows glowing softly in the evening, tables set with an intentional distance between them. I chose a dress I had not worn in years, dark blue, modest, forgiving. I had it cleaned, pressed, hung carefully on the closet door where it watched me come and go. As the date approached, my son called once, brief and efficient, confirming the time, mentioning there would be many people there, family, friends, colleagues. He sounded busy, distracted, but not unkind. I listened more than I spoke, nodding to myself as if he could see it. On the evening of the dinner, I arrived early. Old habits die slowly. I waited near the entrance, watching groups arrive, coats handed off, laughter spilling easily. When my son and his wife appeared, surrounded by others, he smiled and hugged me quickly, his arm light around my shoulders. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that did not quite land. There was no space to talk. We were ushered inside, directed to a long table already half full. I took a seat near the end, assuming it was temporary, that someone would rearrange things once everyone arrived. No one did. Conversations rose and fell around me, stories shared that I had not heard before, jokes referencing trips and dinners I had not been part of. I smiled when people glanced my way, nodded at appropriate moments, though I was not always sure what they were reacting to. At one point, a toast was made. My son stood, glass raised, thanking everyone for coming, for supporting them, for being such an important part of their lives. Applause followed, warm and full. I clapped too, my hands moving automatically, but something in his words caught and held me. He spoke of chosen family, of community, of how grateful he was to be surrounded by people who showed up. The phrase landed gently on the table, unnoticed by anyone else. I felt it settle into me all the same. Courses arrived and were cleared, wine glasses refilled. At some point, my daughter-in-law stood and thanked her parents specifically, praising their constant presence, their help, their sacrifices. Her mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand, eyes shining. I watched the exchange, aware of my own hands folded neatly in my lap. No one looked toward me. It was not dramatic. That was what made it sharp. I realized then that I had misunderstood the invitation. I was not there as family in the way I had imagined. I was there as a symbol, something to be included without being integrated, a quiet proof of propriety. The dinner continued. Photos were taken. Someone suggested a group picture and chairs were shifted, people rearranged. I found myself standing slightly outside the frame, then stepping back further when no one noticed. The photographer snapped the picture without comment. Later, I saw the image on my son's phone as he scrolled through, my absence complete, unquestioned. The realization did not come with anger. It came with clarity. I understood, finally, the shape of my place. When the evening ended, my son hugged me again, thanked me for coming, saying it meant a lot to them. I stared at that sentence longer than I should have, wondering what exactly it was meant to mean. I replied with a polite acknowledgement and put my phone away. The house returned to its familiar quiet, but it felt different now, not empty so much as observant. I noticed how often I replayed small exchanges from the evening, not the obvious moments, but the glances that slid past me, the way conversations curved away before I could step into them. I told myself I was being sensitive. That is what women of my generation were taught to say when something felt wrong but no one else seemed bothered. Still, the feeling did not loosen its hold. A few days later, my daughter-in-law posted photos online. I do not usually look for those things, but a neighbor mentioned how lovely the pictures were, how happy everyone looked. That evening, curiosity overcame restraint. I scrolled slowly, recognizing faces, table settings, the restaurant's soft lighting. I was not in any of them, not cropped out, not hidden behind someone else, simply absent. I felt a small, involuntary laugh leave my throat, more surprised than amused. It was not that I needed to be seen by strangers. It was the ease with which I had been erased. I closed the app and sat very still, letting the information settle without argument. A few days after that, my son called. He spoke quickly, as if he only had a small window, told me they were planning another gathering soon, something casual, and that I would be welcome to stop by if I liked. The phrasing caught my attention. Welcome to stop by, not invited. I said I would see how I felt closer to the time. There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable, then he changed the subject. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and placed my hands flat on the surface, grounding myself in the cool wood. I realized then that something inside me had reached its limit, not with noise or anger, but with quiet refusal. I was tired of translating myself into something smaller to fit spaces that no longer made room for me. The breaking point did not arrive with a shout. It arrived one afternoon when I went to the bank to ask a simple question about an account. I had brought paperwork, old statements, things I kept carefully organized in a folder. The teller was young, polite, efficient. She frowned slightly as she looked at the screen, then asked me to wait while she checked something. When she returned, she spoke gently, told me there had been recent changes made, authorizations I did not remember granting. She assumed I knew. I did not correct her right away. I listened. She explained calmly, professionally, as if it were all very ordinary. I thanked her and said I would need to look into it further. Walking home, I felt a strange sense of alignment, as if emotional confusion and practical reality had finally met in the same place. At home, I pulled out documents I had not reviewed in years, papers signed in trust, in love, in the belief that family required no safeguards. I did not panic. Panic would have been easier. Instead, I felt a steady resolve begin to form, quiet and unmistakable. That evening, my son sent another message asking if everything was all right, saying I had seemed distant lately. I read it once and did not respond. Not yet. I needed time, not to plan, but to see clearly. Over the next days, I paid attention in a new way. I listened not to what was said, but to what was assumed. I noticed how often decisions were made without consulting me, how information arrived already concluded. I thought about the dinner again, about the toast praising those who showed up, and understood it differently now. Showing up, I realized, was only valued when it served someone else's story. Alone in my living room, I practiced saying nothing. It was harder than it sounded. Silence invites questions, and questions invite explanations. I resisted both. When my son called again, I let it go to voicemail. His message was light, joking even, asking if I was upset about something, telling me not to worry so much. That phrase stayed with me, "Don't worry so much," as if worry were the problem, not its cause. I began to sleep poorly again, waking in the early hours with thoughts lined up neatly, waiting their turn. I did not feel sad in the way I once had. The sadness had burned itself down to something more solid, more useful. I thought about my life, about the years I had spent being reliable, available, forgiving, about how easily those qualities had been mistaken for permanence. One morning, as sunlight filled the kitchen, I looked around and felt a surprising sense of ownership, not of the house itself, but of my presence within it. I realized that whatever came next would require patience and discretion. I was not interested in confrontation. I wanted understanding, and understanding takes time. That realization steadied me. Still, beneath that calm, tension remained, threads pulled tight, waiting. I sensed that once they began to move, there would be no easy way to return them to their original shape. And for the first time, that did not frighten me. After that morning, I began to move through my days differently, not faster or slower, just with a new kind of attention. I stopped explaining myself aloud when no one was there to listen. I stopped rehearsing conversations that might never happen. Instead, I watched. I listened. I let patterns finish forming before I named them. The house seemed to respond to this change. It felt less like a waiting room and more like a place where things were allowed to exist without apology. I kept my routines because routines are anchors, but I loosened my expectations around them. If a chore waited until tomorrow, I let it. If a letter went unopened for a day, I allowed that too. I was practicing endurance of a different kind, one that did not require me to bend. My son called less often, which I noticed without comment. When he did call, his tone was light, careful, as if testing the surface of a lake before stepping onto it. I matched that tone without effort. There was no anger to mask, no enthusiasm to manufacture. I answered questions directly and did not volunteer extra information. This seemed to unsettle him more than confrontation ever would have. Silence, I was learning, has weight when it is chosen. I spent time sorting through old files, not with urgency, but with curiosity. Deeds, statements, insurance papers, correspondence. I arranged them neatly, labeled folders, made notes in the margins where my memory needed assistance. I did not tell anyone I was doing this. It felt private, like tidying thoughts rather than rooms. Occasionally, I would come across something that made me pause, a signature placed too quickly, a clause I had skimmed years ago when trust felt sufficient. I noted these things without judgment. Regret was unproductive. Awareness was enough. In the afternoons, I walked more. The neighborhood had changed subtly over time. Houses sold, hedges trimmed differently, children grown. People waved, asked polite questions, offered brief updates. I listened kindly and shared little. I noticed how often I had once filled silences with reassurance, with explanations meant to smooth discomfort that was not mine to fix. Now I let pauses stand. They passed on their own. One evening, my son stopped by unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway longer than usual, as if unsure whether to step fully inside. I invited him in, offered tea. He declined, saying he didn't have much time. He looked around the living room, noting small changes I hadn't consciously made. A chair moved closer to the window, a stack of books where magazines used to be. He asked how I was. I said I was well. The word felt accurate. He nodded, then said he had noticed I had been quiet lately. I told him I had been listening more. He smiled uncertainly, then spoke about work, about plans, about things that did not require my input. I listened. When he left, he hugged me briefly, awkwardly, as if unsure where to place his hands. After he was gone, I sat for a long time without turning on a light. I did not feel lonely. I felt resolved. At night, sleep came and went in pieces. I would wake early, lie still, and think through details calmly, without narrative, without assigning roles of villain or victim. I reminded myself that most harm is done not through malice, but through convenience. That understanding did not excuse anything, but it freed me from needing to dramatize it. I began to write things down, not letters, not plans, just observations. Dates, conversations, decisions made in my absence. The act of writing steadied me. It created continuity where there had been only reaction. I did not know yet what I would do with these notes, only that they mattered. Weeks passed. Spring deepened. Trees outside the window filled in with leaves, obscuring views that had been clear all winter. I noticed the change and thought about how growth often hides as much as it reveals. My daughter-in-law sent a message once, brief and cordial, asking if I could watch their dog during an upcoming trip. I read it carefully, noting the assumption embedded within the request. I replied that I would not be available, no explanation. The response came quickly, polite but cool. I felt a small tightening in my chest, then release. Each boundary, once set, made the next one easier. I continued my preparations quietly. Appointments were made and kept. Questions were asked and answered. Information accumulated in a way that felt almost organic, like a picture developing slowly in a darkroom. I was careful not to rush it. Rushing leads to mistakes, and I had learned that mistakes are often more costly than delays. I did not speak of any of this to friends or neighbors. Their concern would have been genuine, but concern has a way of pulling you back into familiar roles. I was no longer interested in being comforted. I wanted clarity. Occasionally, doubt would surface, a soft voice asking whether I was overreacting, whether I should simply let things go for the sake of peace. I listened to that voice too, considered it, then set it aside. Peace that requires erasure is not peace.
By early summer, the tension that had once felt heavy now felt coiled, contained, not explosive, just ready. I sensed that circumstances were aligning in ways I could not fully predict but could recognize when they arrived. I did not feel triumphant, I felt patient. Still, beneath that patience, there was an awareness that something irreversible was approaching, something that would require me to stand firmly in the shape I had finally allowed myself to take. I did not know when that moment would come. I only knew that when it did, I would not step aside. Summer settled in quietly, without announcement, as if it had learned from me. The days lengthened, light lingering in the evenings in a way that felt almost generous. I opened windows instead of turning on fans, letting the house breathe as I did. My routines held, but they were no longer rigid. I moved with intention now, not habit. Each morning I reviewed what needed doing and what did not. That distinction mattered more than I had once believed. Some tasks were necessary, others were inherited expectations that no longer served anyone. I let those fall away without ceremony. My son called again, asking if I wanted to join them for lunch one weekend. He framed it casually, as if it were a spontaneous thought rather than a test. I told him I had plans. This was true, though the plans were my own and did not require witnesses. There was a pause, then he said, maybe another time. I agreed. After the call ended, I noticed my hands were steady. That seemed worth noting. I continued attending appointments, asking questions, listening carefully to answers. I learned to sit comfortably in waiting rooms, to observe without filling the silence with nervous movement. People spoke more freely when I did not rush them. I let that work in my favor. At home, I reorganized spaces that had long gone untouched. A drawer of old keys, some labeled, some not. A box of photographs that smelled faintly of dust and glue. I sorted without sentimentality, keeping what felt essential, releasing what felt performative. Memory, I realized, does not live in objects. It lives in the body, in reactions you cannot train away. One afternoon, I found a folder tucked behind a shelf in the study, something I had placed there years ago and forgotten. Inside were copies of documents I had requested long before, back when I still believed preparation was a form of pessimism. I sat at the desk and read through them slowly, line by line, noticing how language can obscure as much as it clarifies. I did not feel alarmed. I felt vindicated, quietly. That evening, I cooked a simple meal and ate it on the back porch, watching the sun drop behind the fence. A neighbor's laughter drifted over, uninvited but not unwelcome. I thought about how sound travels without permission, how presence does not always require invitation. My daughter-in-law sent another message a few days later, this time asking if I had received a package that had been mistakenly delivered to my address. I had not. I told her so. Her reply was curt, efficient. I imagined her frustration briefly, then let it go. Their small inconveniences no longer felt like my responsibility. My son visited again in late June. He seemed restless, paced slightly as he spoke, glanced at his phone more than usual. He mentioned finances offhandedly, rising costs, responsibilities piling up. I listened without offering solutions. He asked if I was managing all right on my own. I said yes. He smiled, relieved, and said he worried sometimes. The concern felt abstract, unconnected to action. When he left, I noticed he had not asked any follow-up questions. Concern, I was learning, can be performative too. As summer deepened, I began spending time in the early mornings outside before the heat settled in. I sat with a cup of tea and listened to birds argue in the hedges, to the distant sound of traffic waking up. These moments grounded me. They reminded me that life continues, regardless of personal narratives. I did not feel invisible out there. I felt appropriately small, which was different. One morning, I received a letter that was not addressed to me, but mentioned my name several times. I read it carefully, then read it again. I placed it back in the envelope and set it aside. I did not act on it immediately. Reaction would have been premature. I waited instead, allowing context to gather around it. Waiting had become a skill, honed through necessity. My son called that weekend, his tone unusually warm, asking how I was feeling, whether everything was okay. I told him I was enjoying the weather. He laughed lightly, then said they were thinking about the future, about making sure things were organized. The phrasing was vague, but the intention beneath it was not. I responded neutrally, neither encouraging nor resisting. When the call ended, I wrote down what had been said, word for word, while it was still fresh. Not because I distrusted my memory, but because accuracy matters when stories begin to shift. At night, sleep returned in longer stretches. I dreamed less, or perhaps I remembered less. Either way, mornings felt clearer. I no longer woke with that familiar knot of anticipation, the sense that something was about to be asked of me. Instead, I woke with curiosity. What would today reveal if I let it? I noticed how often people underestimate stillness. They mistake it for weakness, for indecision. They do not realize how much strength it takes to remain unmoved while others circle, waiting for reaction. I had become good at that. By midsummer, the tension I carried felt refined, like a tool rather than a burden. I sensed that others were adjusting around me, recalibrating expectations they had never examined before. This pleased me quietly, though pleasure was not my goal. I wanted alignment. I wanted the external world to match what had already settled inside me. I knew something would surface soon, something that would require acknowledgement rather than avoidance. I did not know exactly how it would arrive, only that when it did, I would recognize it immediately. That knowledge stayed with me, steady and unresolved, as the season stretched on, bright and unhurried, waiting for the moment when observation would no longer be enough. The call came on a Tuesday morning, ordinary in every way except for the way my body responded before my mind caught up. I was watering the plants near the window when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I let it ring once longer than usual, then answered. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, careful with pauses. He introduced himself, referenced a file number, then my name. He asked if I had a few minutes to talk about a property matter. I said yes. I always say yes to clarity. He explained that there had been a request submitted regarding my house, a preliminary inquiry tied to refinancing and potential transfer. He spoke as if this were routine, as if families did this sort of thing every day. I listened without interrupting, my hand still resting on the watering can, water pooling silently at my feet. When he finished, I asked one question, quiet and precise. Who authorized it? There was a pause. He gave my son's name. He added that it had been done under an assumption of consent based on documents already on file. When the call ended, I stood very still. I did not feel shocked. I felt confirmed. The house around me looked the same as it had moments before, sunlight steady on the walls, nothing dramatic shifting or cracking. That steadiness helped. I turned off the water, set the can down, and sat at the table with my notes. Everything I needed was already there. The earlier bank visit, the subtle language, the casual concern about finances, the questions framed as worry. It arranged itself neatly now, like pieces finally allowed to touch. I did not call my son. Not yet. I contacted the man back and asked for copies of everything. He sent them within the hour. I read slowly, carefully, noting dates, signatures, phrasing. There it was. The quiet assumption that because I had once trusted, I always would, that because I had been generous, I would remain available. I felt no anger as I read, only a tightening resolve. This was not misunderstanding, this was presumption.
That afternoon, I went to the office downtown, the one with glass walls and neutral colors meant to calm people before difficult conversations. I brought my folder. I sat across from someone who spoke clearly, explained options, confirmed facts. I asked questions. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what was mine and what had been attempted without my consent. The process unfolded efficiently after that. Documents reviewed, authorizations revoked, safeguards put in place, boundaries made official in a way that could not be smiled through or brushed aside. When I signed the final paper, my hand did not shake. I noticed that too. On the way home, I stopped for groceries, mundane things, bread, fruit, milk, life continuing as it always does, even at moments of quiet turning. That evening, my son called. His voice was different this time, careful in a way that did not pretend casualness. He asked if I had been contacted by anyone about the house. I said yes. There was silence on the line, longer than any we had shared before. Then he spoke quickly, explanations tumbling over one another, concern mixed with reassurance, telling me it was meant to help, that I shouldn't worry, that they were only trying to plan ahead. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I said one sentence. I said that planning ahead does not require secrecy. The silence that followed was heavier. He asked if I was upset. I said I was informed. That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. He shifted, tried another approach, mentioned stress, responsibilities, how hard things had been. I did not argue with any of it. Difficulty does not grant permission. When he asked what I was going to do, I told him the truth. I said I had already taken care of it. My calm unsettled him. He asked what that meant. I told him everything was now clearly documented, protected, and that no further action would be possible without my direct involvement. He accused me gently then, not with words, but with tone, suggesting I didn't trust him. I let that sit. Trust, I said finally, requires transparency. After the call ended, I sat alone in the living room and let the quiet return. It felt different now, not heavy, not expectant, just present. I knew he would speak to his wife, that stories would be adjusted, that concern would be reframed as betrayal. I could already imagine the conversations I would not be part of. That was fine. The truth did not require my participation to remain true. In the days that followed, messages arrived, cautious, probing. I responded briefly, factually. There were no accusations in my words, no emotional appeals. I did not need to defend myself. The documents did that now. One afternoon, I received a visit I had anticipated but not rushed. My son stood at the door, his expression tight, his posture uncertain. I invited him in. We sat at opposite ends of the room, distance acknowledged without comment. He spoke about intentions, about family, about feeling shut out. I listened. When he finished, I told him I loved him and that love does not erase accountability. I explained, calmly, that what had been attempted crossed a line I could not ignore, that my silence before had been mistaken for consent. I did not raise my voice. I did not soften the message either. He left without resolution. That was inevitable. Some truths do not offer immediate comfort. That night, I slept deeply, uninterrupted. In the morning, sunlight filled the house, steady and unchanged. I moved through my rooms with a sense of solidity I had not felt in years. The tension that had once coiled inside me loosened, not into relief, but into certainty. What came next would not be easy, but it would be honest. Still, as calm as I felt, I knew consequences were already forming beyond my walls, conversations unfolding without me, interpretations hardening. Separation, I sensed, was no longer theoretical. It was approaching, quietly, and it would require me to hold my ground without bitterness. That understanding stayed with me, unresolved, as I waited to see what shape the aftermath would take. The days after that conversation unfolded with a strange restraint, as if everyone involved had agreed, without saying so, to handle the truth only in measured doses. My son did not call again right away. Instead, messages arrived sporadically, neutral in tone, logistical in nature. Questions about mail, about a document he claimed he could not locate, about whether I would be home at certain times. I answered what was necessary and ignored what was not. Each response felt deliberate, not cold, simply complete. I was no longer interested in filling gaps that others created. My daughter-in-law did not contact me at all. That absence was louder than any message could have been. I imagined her version of events forming elsewhere, shaped by omission and emphasis, and I let it exist without interference. I had spent too many years correcting narratives that were never mine to control. At the grocery store, I ran into her mother, who greeted me warmly, asked how I was doing. I smiled and said I was well. She mentioned how stressful things had been for young families these days, how hard it was to manage everything. I listened politely, then excused myself. Sympathy, I had learned, often arrives too late to be useful. At home, the house felt settled, almost protective. I rearranged nothing, yet everything seemed to have found its place. I cooked for myself without excess, ate at the table without distraction, washed dishes immediately after. These small acts grounded me. They reminded me that care does not need an audience. One afternoon, a letter arrived from my son, handwritten, something I had not received in years. I held it for a long moment before opening it, not out of fear, but out of respect for my own steadiness. Inside, he wrote about feeling hurt, about not recognizing me lately, about how this situation had created distance he did not know how to bridge. He spoke of family obligations, of expectations he believed we shared. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the breach itself. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. I did not respond. Some words are not meant to be answered. A week later, he came by to collect a few things he said he had left behind over the years. He moved through the house quietly, almost reverently, as if aware that this was no longer a space he inhabited freely. I showed him the box I had prepared, items neatly packed, labeled. He thanked me, his voice low. We stood near the door, uncertain. He said he hoped things could return to normal. I told him calmly that normal changes when trust changes. He nodded, though I could see he did not fully accept it. Acceptance, like clarity, cannot be rushed. When he left, I closed the door gently and rested my hand against it for a moment. I did not feel grief in the way I once had. I felt something closer to acknowledgement. This was the shape of things now. In the weeks that followed, separation became practical. Holidays were discussed vaguely and then not at all. Invitations stopped arriving. News traveled indirectly through neighbors or casual mentions. I learned of trips taken, plans made, milestones celebrated elsewhere. Each piece of information landed softly, no longer sharp. I was no longer waiting to be included. That distinction mattered. I spent time with people who knew me as I was now, not as a role they expected me to play. Coffee with an old friend who did not ask for explanations, long walks with a neighbor who spoke mostly about her garden. These interactions felt honest in their simplicity. Occasionally, doubt resurfaced, usually late at night, asking whether firmness had cost me something irretrievable. I listened to that question without panic. Loss, I realized, is not always the worst outcome. Sometimes the greater loss is staying where you are diminished. That understanding settled me again. My son sent one final message toward the end of summer, telling me they would be busy for a while, that things were complicated, that he hoped I understood. I replied that I did, and I meant it. Complication had been the constant. Clarity was the change. As autumn approached, I noticed how easily I moved through my days. There was no longer a need to anticipate disappointment or manage expectations.
The future felt open in a way it had not before, not because it promised joy, but because it no longer threatened erasure. I thought often about the line between love and access, about how easily one is mistaken for the other. Loving someone does not mean surrendering yourself. I had learned that late, but not too late. Still, the separation was not complete. It hovered, undefined, waiting for time to finish its work. I knew there would be moments ahead, anniversaries, holidays, when the absence would feel heavier. I did not deny that. I simply trusted that I would meet those moments as I had met these, with quiet honesty. As the leaves began to turn outside my window, I felt a sense of nearing, not an ending, but a settling. Something long, unstable was finding its level. I did not know exactly what peace would look like once it fully arrived. I only knew that I was closer to it than I had ever been, and that whatever came next would be lived on terms I no longer needed to negotiate. By the time winter returned, it did so gently, without the sharp insistence it once carried. The first cold morning found me awake before dawn, standing at the window with a cup of tea warming my hands, watching frost gather quietly along the edges of the grass. I noticed how my body no longer braced itself against the season. There was no counting of days, no anticipation of messages that might or might not arrive. Christmas approached again, marked only by the calendar and a few decorations and shop windows I passed on my walks. I did not put up a tree, not as a statement, not out of bitterness, but because I did not feel the need to perform hope anymore. Instead, I placed a single candle on the table and lit it in the evenings, letting its steady flame keep me company. It was enough. The silence that once felt accusatory now felt earned. It was no longer the silence of being left out, but the silence of choosing myself without apology. My days filled naturally. I volunteered twice a week at the local library, shelving books, helping children find stories they wanted to return to again and again. Their certainty about what they loved felt instructive. I cooked meals that suited my appetite rather than an imagined guest list. I slept deeply. I woke without that familiar tightening in my chest, the one that used to ask what I owed the day before it even began. My son did not reach out during the holidays. I noticed the absence and let it pass through me like cold air, sharp at first, then gone. I sent a simple card, unsigned beyond my name, wishing them well. There was no reply. That, too, was information. I placed the matter gently where it belonged, outside of myself. Over time, I stopped explaining the situation, even in my own thoughts. It no longer required narrative. It simply was. Friends asked occasionally, careful with their curiosity, how my family was doing. I answered honestly but briefly. We are living separate lives now, I would say. The words did not sting. They described a fact, not a failure. I learned that independence, when it finally arrives, is quieter than people imagine. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of having won anything. There was only a deep, settled rightness, like standing on solid ground after years of adjusting to uneven footing. I began making small plans for myself, modest things I had postponed without realizing it, a short trip to the coast in early spring, a class at the community center, rearranging the study into a space that suited my thinking rather than my usefulness to others. Each decision reinforced the same truth. I was allowed to shape my life without asking permission. One afternoon, months later, I came across the blue dress still hanging in the closet. I took it down, held it up to the light, and then folded it carefully into a donation bag. Letting it go did not feel like loss. It felt like accuracy. I had no interest in dressing myself for rooms where I would always stand just outside the frame. The house, too, seemed to reflect this shift. It was not fuller exactly, but it was truer. Objects remained where I placed them. Time moved at a pace that felt humane. I no longer measured my worth by how easily others could access me. I measured it by how clearly I could hear myself think. Occasionally, memories surfaced unexpectedly. A sound, a phrase, the particular way my son used to laugh when he was younger. These moments brought tenderness rather than pain. I allowed them their place without letting them pull me backward. Love does not disappear simply because boundaries are drawn. It changes form. I carried mine quietly, without expectation of return. That was not martyrdom. It was freedom. As the year turned, I reflected not on what I had lost, but on what I had gained by refusing to be diminished. I had gained time that belonged to me. I had gained peace that did not depend on anyone else's behavior. Most importantly, I had gained a sense of self that was no longer negotiable. There was dignity in that, one I had not known I was missing until it arrived. On the anniversary of the Christmas that had once broken something open in me, I woke early and sat in the same chair by the window. The house was quiet. The world outside was pale and new. I did not feel sad. I felt present. I understood then that closure is not something others give you. It is something you claim when you stop waiting for permission to move on. I had not sought revenge. I had not demanded apologies. I had simply stepped out of a story that no longer made room for my full humanity. That, it turned out, was enough. I finished my tea, sat the cup in the sink, and went about my day, steady and unencumbered, carrying with me a calm certainty I had earned slowly and would not surrender again.